I'm very honored, I'm very humbled to be a part of this study, and if you were expecting Brother Ron from earlier drafts of the schedule, please believe that I'm as disappointed as you are that he couldn't be with us. But I wish him the best, and I hope that I can have something to say that might be helpful, given that you're stuck with me for now. Even though I'm not a full-time preacher, I have been appointed as a congregational teacher at the Valley Parkway congregation in Louisville, and I take that role very, very seriously. And as our brother mentioned, my participation in this study is presumably grounded in the intersection of my role as a congregational teacher with my current role as a professor and a social scientist, where I have tackled this topic of cults as well. A few years ago, I started conducting research on a project alongside one of my coworkers at the University of Oklahoma, which is where I worked at the time, related to that study of cults. And that's my topic today. I know that a couple of years ago, Brother Richard gave us a similar topic, which I thought was very helpful and very interesting. And so I want to be clear that I don't think I can improve on anything that Brother Richard taught us. Basically, what I'm trying to do is just kind of continue the conversation. So I want to tell you a little bit about my work on this project with my coworker on a research article, and then I'll talk about some things that I think can be related to our work in the church. So specifically, what my coworker and I were interested in is how news media communicates about cults. That is, when a group is labeled as a cult, what qualities are likely to be attributed to that group. We examined over 1,500 articles from the Associated Press that used the word cult, and then we categorized all of the qualities from those articles that were attributed to the cult-labeled groups. And I can comment in more detail during the Q&A if you're interested in our methodological process, but for now I'm just going to kind of dive into the meat of our findings. And I also feel that I should give a brief disclaimer here. Sometimes I mention that I have studied cults, and I bring that up, and people are fascinated. It's like this mysterious and interesting topic to a lot of people. And most of us know something about a cult or some cults that have caught our attention or whatever. And as much as I would love to say that I'm familiar with every cult that you might have read about or seen on TV or something, that's probably not the case. So my specific study was honed in on 3 particularly clear-cut examples of cults, and I think that our findings are transferable to other things that we can learn about cults. But if you have a question for me that's specific to a particular kind of cult or a cult that you know about, I may or may not be able to talk about individual groups. So I'm always happy to talk with folks and to learn from you if there's something that you want to share with me about an individual group, but my own expertise is in how the popular press attaches the label of cult to target groups, and in the socio-philosophical roots of society's fears of cults. And I think knowing a little bit about why the society and culture around us is afraid of cults tells us a bit about the concerns that they might have, why they weaponize those labels, and then how we might be able to negotiate our own labels with others. So since conducting my research project, I've done teaching about the subject of cults, both at professional conferences and also from the pulpit from time to time. And the subject has essentially become a part of my church teaching for a couple of reasons. A big one for me is that I think it can serve as a mechanism of accountability. And my idea here is that with greater knowledge of how groups become labeled as cults, leaders in religious organizations, including the Churches of Christ, can compare behaviors in our groups to research identified warning signs for cults and use those markers for congregational responsibility. Even though, to be very clear up front, I cannot, through my research or any other experience, find anything intrinsically cult-like about Christianity or the Churches of Christ. And I think that's an important thing to mention up front here as well. So, the purpose of my presentation is to present contemporary research-based perspectives on the constitution of religious cults, and that's toward two primary ends in my view. The first end is to encourage sensitivity and cautiousness so that we can train our own leaders to avoid the hurtful things associated with cults. And the second thing is to develop awareness of cult-like warning signs so that we can help those in need if someone brings a concern about cultism to our attention. So I'm going to go ahead and give you kind of a rationale for studying this as a part of the church and to have a bit of awareness about this subject in general. There's a reason that the term cult has currency in our current social landscape. Fear of groups that we might call cults escalated in the 1980s for people in the United States. So this term was around longer than that, but that's when it really took off in terms of popularization, and that was largely in response to charismatic leaders like Jim Jones or David Koresh, who were known for twisting the words of the Bible toward malicious purposes, using the text in a way that we would not be able to in a way that seems unintended by the text itself so that they can hurt other people and accrue power for themselves. So because of the popularization of groups like that in the news, many people are now cautious about religious organizations because they have either heard or they have witnessed ways that spiritual leaders and people who are supposed to be helpful actually turned out to hurt their congregants. According to anthropologist Robert J. Lifton, one of the major abuses at the forefront of people's minds is something called mind control, the idea that a speaker can be so manipulative that they essentially steal away the listener's free will. This is also something called a magic bullet theory in communication scholarship. In this line of reasoning, the term cult is sometimes thrust upon groups who seem to be overly strict to people outside the group, because perhaps people from outside the group have difficulty understanding how someone would want to live with a certain kind of discipline or strictness in their life, so it must be that they've been manipulated or doing something beyond their control. Given these concerns, I do think it's productive for people belonging to any group, really, with significant influence in their lives to ask the question, am I part of a cult? But then the tricky part of that is actually answering what's a more fundamental question. If I were a part of a cult, how would I know that? Sometimes very well-intended people try and answer this question, but become bogged down in just trying to define a cult and understanding what it is. And the outcome is often something like throwing up one's hands and saying it doesn't really matter how people label us. And even though I understand certainly the frustrations that come with responding to this topic, I do want to offer that it's important for us to come up with concrete answers to questions about cultism for at least two reasons. One reason, sociologist Eileen Barker, and then in the study that I worked on with Dr. Michael Kramer, have clearly identified that the term cult carries a pejorative meaning. In other words, a cult is a group to be avoided, and that is clearly counterproductive to the mission of evangelism and Christianity. Secondly, passages like James 1, 13 through 16, John 1, 12 through 13, and many others we could speak of, talk about the importance of what we might call free moral agency. That's the idea that we should be concerned about whether our faith is our own, whether it belongs to us, or whether we have been manipulated into thinking something because someone told us to through some kind of systematic programming, right? So with these reasons for studying cultism, I want to use this presentation to examine three main areas. The first area is, can we define a cult? Secondly, how should Christians respond to cults? And third, how can Christians ensure that they are avoiding cult-like behaviors? And I think all three of these things can be valuable to us in our mission as Christians. So we're going to dive into this challenge of defining a cult. One difficulty in answering that question is that the term does not actually appear in the Bible. And there's very little consistency in the way that scholars have approached this subject as well. I do think that cults, as we might use the term today contemporarily, are maybe alluded to in the Bible. There are figures who are similar to, say, cult-like leaders or charismatic leaders. That term isn't a part of any original manuscripts or texts there. But I do want to highlight that there are some examples of figures that are very similar to cult-like leaders. So I'm going to read a few passages that point us toward the fact that the Bible is concerned with whether spiritual leaders are manipulating people. So, for example, when Peter and the other apostles were being accused by the Pharisees in Acts 5, verses 35 through 39, we have a statement that's given by one of the religious leaders named Gamaliel. And he says, starting in verse 35, "Men of Israel, take heed to yourselves that what you intend to do regarding these men. For some time ago, Theudas rose up claiming to be somebody. A number of men, about 400, joined him. He was slain, and all who obeyed him were scattered and came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census and drew away many people after him. He also perished, and all who obeyed him were dispersed," and so on and so forth. So in this passage, Gamaliel recognized that new religious leaders would occasionally rise up, but he also noted that the groups forged by these new leaders often dispersed with time, not unlike contemporary cults, which more or less destroy themselves, thinking about perhaps the People's Temple or Om Shinrikyo. There are many cults that, through their doomsday beliefs, ultimately just destroy themselves. Later in Acts 24 and verse 5, the Bible is even more explicit about naming outlier religious groups when Paul's accusers call him a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. The term sect is the closest thing that we have to the modern word cult that appears in Scripture. I explained this term a little bit and why it was so popular in my research publication with Dr. Kramer. I'm going to read a quick quote here. We wrote, "There is a difference between popular understandings of cults and what have been called sects. The word from which we derive cult, Latin cultus or Greek cultura, have been historically synonymous with culture. The words simply refer to a group of people unified by methods of cultivation. A different term, heraio, which is a Greek term meaning heresy, distinguishes a culture from a splinter group, a heresy, or a sect." In other words, humankind didn't actually describe themselves as different from one another for some time, as far as we know, right? They don't describe themselves as being different cultures. Everyone was essentially one tribe until the Tower of Babel incident recorded in Genesis 11, in which God splinters the languages of humankind and then scatters people about the globe, and they begin to develop their own unique ways of cultivation as different tribes, groups, or cultures. So as ancient peoples began to develop their own unique traditions, they began to refer to those with different traditions as either being separate nations, which is a reference to sovereignty, or as different cultures, which refers back to social trends, beliefs, tools, and so forth. And eventually, as we get more and more toward our contemporary time in the United States, people ran across the problem that folks in the same culture might actually splinter into co-cultural or subcultural groups, and those which were very far out of the mainstream would be called heresies. And the Greek word for heresy is where we derive our English term for sect. And the English-speaking world discovers, as we become more and more modern and postmodern, the need for more precise terminology. And this was especially true during the New Age religious movements of the 1800s. For those who are interested in that, the book Kingdom of the Cults by Walter R. Martin comes up regularly. That gives a good account of the history and existence of a wave of New Age cults that were around in the 1800s. I wouldn't say that the book is especially helpful in defining cults, and we can talk more about that if you're interested during the Q&A. But that book comes up regularly in religious studies. I want to instead focus some attention on a theological scholar named Henry C. Meserve. And Meserve basically argues that people in religious denominations were becoming fearful that they would be coupled together with groups that were outside of the mainstream, with these New Age groups, and as a result, the religious mainstream would begin popularizing different kinds of terms rather than sect. So we more and more see the term denomination being used to distinguish between religious co-cultures, and the term cult is popularized to delineate what is perceived to be a dangerous religious co-culture. It's so that people with mainstream religious beliefs could push others away and say, we're not associated or affiliated with that group. My study with Dr. Kramer, in addition to research from sociologists like J.T. Richardson, found that the word cult actually grows to become increasingly generic. And now it is basically used in the abstract for any highly organized group that is disliked by the speaker. So what is a cult? There is no concrete answer to this question anymore. If you survey literature from religion, from sociology, from anthropology, from communication, from media studies, there are lots of attempts to define cultic groups. There is no clear consensus on the contemporary constitution of cults. So the best answer that I think we can come up with is that people throw out this term cult to stigmatize people they don't like. That's the linguistic function of the term. And I do think this means that we should be very leery about using that terminology, given that it's basically just a pejorative, or it's mostly used for name calling. This does not mean that we should just blanketly reject concerns about cultism if they are brought to us, though. Because if someone has a fear or concern that a group is a cult, that means there is something wrong in the relationship between that person and the group. And in some cases, that damage might be based on very real hurt or abuses or other dangers. So any honest group should take this kind of relational damage very seriously and be open to fair criticisms if fair criticisms are brought forward. There are some harmful behaviors that are often attributed to groups that are labeled as cults. So, given that cults don't necessarily have a single set of organizational qualities, I do think that despite what you may see here, I'm going to try and explain this and give it some more context in just a moment. I think that we should be more concerned with the kinds of negative connotations that are often associated with groups labeled as cults than being in the business of trying to throw out this term cult and attach it to other groups. Knowing about these connotations helps us compare perceptions of cults with what Christianity is supposed to be about according to the Bible. Now, my study with Dr. Kramer on news coverage of cults identified 7 concerns that are often associated with cults in the popular press. That doesn't mean that every group labeled as a cult is going to have every single one of these concerns. It doesn't necessarily mean that a group with every one of these qualities is automatically going to be labeled as a cult. These are more like sensitizing concepts. These are the things that are often concerns when a group is being given that label of cult. So these 7 concerns include totalism, the idea that a leadership has extensive and undue influence in the lives of members. Usually that's manifested as some kind of manipulative, controlling behavior, like mind control. Second is suspicion of others, and usually this is paired with threats of violence, directing hatred toward people outside the group, and an obsession with impending doom, often including the amassment or use of weapons to help carry out that impending doom. Fringe beliefs, usually related to eschatology or beliefs about some kind of imminent end time and a physical war between congregants and the rest of the world. Unusual organization. Typically this involves some kind of charismatic leader, a strict, rigid, hierarchical leadership structure, and an isolationist living style, like pulling people away into a commune. Then we have member abuse. This can be physical, verbal, or emotional harm to members of the group, usually in an attempt to manipulate the members of the group who question the leadership. 6th, financial manipulation. So most groups generally consider to be cults featured leaders who would demand most or total control of the members' assets for themselves. And finally, something that we called alignment behaviors in the study. For practical purposes, this is essentially defensiveness, that the group has enough of a long-standing history of strange or antisocial behavior that their default communication with outsiders is to just be defensive in their communication with them. I'm going to elaborate on each of these shortly. I know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. Again, these qualities are not necessarily consistent in every group labeled as a cult, and not every group that receives the label features those qualities. The point of the list is not to help you say, this is a cult. The point of the list is to provide a research-supported perspective on what common concerns spring to mind for the average person who thinks of this term cult, so that those concerns can be specifically addressed, right? Given this information, I do think that Christians should be willing to tell people who inquire that they are not part of a cult. In other words, don't be ambivalent to that label. Of course, if and only if they have genuinely investigated concerns that people have brought to them and have found that they are not falling into any hurtful behaviors. If a religious group is challenged with the label of cult, then my recommendation would be to ask the concerned party what they mean by that. This was good advice that I learned from Brother Richard in his sermon. And then I think based on the meaning that they give you, which is likely to include some combination of the 7 qualities that you can see projected, the leadership can address first whether their group is actually engaging in those behaviors, and secondly, they can give a specific response based on specific behavioral concerns rather than generically trying to contend with this term cult. So I do want to spend some time talking about how I think Christians should respond to each of these qualities. I'm going to go ahead and say up front that each of these qualities are concerning for a reason and should be concerning. If someone comes to us and they say that they have a concern about one of these things, that should be an alarm that maybe there's something that could be addressed there. So I do want to compare these 7 qualities and concerns with Scripture, and the idea here is going to be to use these concerns as a baseline from which we can say whether a church or another group is emulating hurtful behaviors, cult-like behaviors. And I hope that we'll pay special attention to what the Bible says about these subjects, because again, even though I don't believe there is anything intrinsically cult-like, especially in the modern sense of the word, about Christianity or the churches of Christ, it's possible that individuals or that specific groups within any religious body can start to develop these toxic qualities or communications if they aren't on guard to avoid them. And conversely, I also think it's possible that a person might want to use a slanderous label without actually being able to point to wrongdoing. And so in that case, knowledge of cults can also help with developing defenses against unfounded, hurtful, or malicious rhetoric. And I hope that we will give attention to both of these things as we're dealing with these qualities. I'm just going to run through this list, starting with totalism. Again, that's the idea that a leadership has extensive and undue influence in the lives of members, usually manifested as some kind of controlling or manipulative behavior. The way that this problem most commonly manifests seems to be when religious leaders create traditions that they then enforce as some kind of religious rule. And sometimes I think this can be done out of a genuine and innocent desire for organization and attention to detail, maybe convenience. But it almost always results in giving authority to the leadership at the expense of the congregants, which is the thing that can be hurtful that we want to avoid. Paul warned against this in Colossians 3, verses 20 through 23, where he said, "Therefore, if you died with Christ from the basic principles of the world, that is, the traditions that came before, why do you subject yourselves to regulations according to the commandments and doctrines of men? These things indeed have an appearance of wisdom, but have no value against the indulgence of the flesh." But even knowing that it's important to focus on enforcing God's rules and not creating new rules of our own, it can perhaps be difficult at times. It can be tricky to see whether or not we are falling into that trap. in our attempt to be thorough, to be organized, to be meticulous, it might become easy to create restrictions for peace of mind, which are fine as personal preferences, but maybe should not be required for all people. And the solution to this problem, in my opinion, is a recognition between the difference between individual moral living and church doctrine. For instance, Acts 4 and verse 37 gives the example of Barnabas selling a tract of land and then giving the money to the apostles. Now, Barnabas, as far as we know, was not required by any doctrine to sell his land to sponsor church work. He decided on his own that selling his land was one way that he could show service. But then Christian leaders might be challenged to adopt cult-like behaviors when they become anxious about how to implement principles based on specific instantiations like that. For instance, what if early Christians saw what Barnabas did, selling his land, and decided that everyone needed to give up their property in order to offer money to the apostles? I realize this was a more widespread phenomenon at the time, but it doesn't seem to be a requirement. That congregation, or conversation rather, would probably start very small. That was great what Barnabas did. He's such an encouraging example to the brethren. We should all be willing to show service like that. But it can get more complicated very quickly. How can we give service to the church? Are there any rules to follow? I don't know, but we know that the apostles accepted Barnabas's gift. So we know that that's very safe. But I'm not sure I have the capability to sell my land. I need that land for farming so that I can work, so that I can support my family. Well, I really sympathize with you, but the story of Jesus with the rich young ruler tells us that we should be really careful about our attachment to earthly things. On the conversation goes. And before anyone knows it, the group has decided that selling off property is the only safe way to actually give service to the church. Well, in that case, the members would have taken an area of personal liberty and then elevated it to a point of doctrine. They've created an unnecessary rule that benefits certain people at the expense of others. Arguably, this issue was at play with Ananias and Sapphira in the next chapter, Acts chapter 5, verses 1 through 22. The church praises Barnabas. They create an unrealistic morality target. Two people are tempted to sin. They lie about what they've done with their land. And so sometimes praising a particular position, because it seems to be the most agreeable, can generate pressure for people to strive for things that aren't necessary. And so it creates challenging and unnecessary barriers for people in their Christian living. Cult leaders are known for this specific thing. They have unusually deep and unnecessary influence in the lives of their followers. They often transition from, yes, I believe in the Bible as the source of authority, to I know how to interpret the Bible, and I know how to interpret it as well or better as anyone else. And all of a sudden, it's just their interpretation of the Bible that's taken as the truth. And so the challenge here is that we started with God as the source of authority, and we end up with the prophet or the cult leader as the source of authority. So if any group wants to avoid imitation of hurtful cult behaviors, they need to sharply distinguish between personal wisdom and doctrine. Those who do use leadership positions to stringently and unnecessarily control the lives of congregants risk becoming those described in Jude 4, people who pervert the grace of God or take advantage of a spiritual position in order to abuse their power. And there are other abuses of power besides control that we can briefly touch on, but I am quickly running out of time, so we're going to go ahead and go on. So here's our first red flag criteria. If someone has concerns about cultism and points to regulations and doctrines of the church leaders should first check on whether they're distinguishing between principles and rules, and then, if so, be able to talk about the differences between those things with the person who has the concern. Secondly, suspicion of others. This is going to go faster as we go along here, so if you're concerned I have this much material for each of the points, I don't. Suspicion of others. It should be evident, I think, from the most quick and shallow reflection on Jesus' teaching that harboring disdain for others is not a part of our Christian values. For example, Matthew 5 and 21, Jesus says things like, "Whoever is angry with his brother without cause is in danger of the judgment." The ancient Egyptian government exemplified this danger of suspicion against entire groups in Exodus chapter 1, all throughout that chapter. So in 1 and 9, the Pharaoh starts making a sharp distinction between the different ethnic groups and the kingdom. In verse 10, Pharaoh fears the potential strength of the Hebrews, and he starts to act out, putting the punishment before the crime. In verse 12, the passage implies that the non-Hebrew Egyptians had essentially decided to adopt their Pharaoh's fear and prejudice. And in verse 22, Pharaoh finally gives the order for the mass murder of male Hebrew babies. This distrust, this us versus them mentality of the Egyptian rulers grew into tension and violence between ethnic groups in the land. And this escalation of fear is also a tenet of New Age cults. The warning that I think modern Christians should take away from this concern is that we should be welcoming. That may seem very simple on the surface. Even though the Bible occasionally illustrates concepts with war metaphors in the New Testament, like spirit against the flesh, we also have to remember that metaphors have specific scopes and contexts. There is no passage in the Bible, in the New Testament, that instructs Christians to literally and physically treat people outside of our congregations as enemy combatants that we need to physically hurt. In fact, I think that conceiving of people beyond a specific religious group as enemies is often counterproductive to evangelism and the mission of Christianity. So instead, Christians should attempt to be a kind neighbor to everyone they encounter, as demonstrated in Luke 10, and for our practices to be characterized by love. And I know that there are boundaries and context to that too, but John 13 and 34 is one place where we read about that, and it should be a characteristic that people can easily observe among us. So if someone has concerns about cultism and worries about an us versus them mentality, first religious leaders need to check whether their group is following the values laid out in places like John 3 and 13, the belief that God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. And even though I think it's fair and valid and appropriate to talk about the subject of condemnation from time to time, our mission is to help people come into the fold and be saved, and that should be the forefront of our conversation with those outside the group. Third, we have fringe beliefs, usually associated with eschatology. So what constitutes a fringe is going to differ depending on the time and place, and so this quality might be a little bit hit or miss. If Christianity happens to be unpopular at a particular time, there might be only so much that can be done about that. On the other hand, there are a handful of unusual beliefs associated with more infamous cults in the United States with which Christians would absolutely not want to be associated. For example, while we don't have sufficient time to dissect the various end-time beliefs that are out in the world, I think it can suffice to say for now that the churches of Christ don't typically believe that humans can predict when the end of the world is going to occur, and Matthew 24 and 36 is a good place to read about that. Also, we have not historically taught that the wars mentioned in the book of Revelation are going to be physical, literal combat between the church and other people in the world. In short, Christians should not be preparing for some kind of imminent end-time combat with other people. And if you just imagine what it would be like to be outside the group and think that a particular group was like developing weapons to use against you, you can see how that might be unsettling, right? So, if someone has concerns about cultism and directs attention to theories about end times, I think particularly in the Church of Christ, leaders can investigate whether they hold any apocalyptic doomsday beliefs, which most I think do not, and all such beliefs would of course be speculative at best and should not have any central place, if any place at all, in Christian activity. Unusual leadership, often charismatic leaders, isolationist living styles. Cults usually have strict organizational hierarchy in which a single person or a small group of people control all the resources and all the interpretation of Scripture. I believe this is contrary to the structure that we are given for congregational leadership in the Bible, which is almost always diffused between multiple peoples. For example, we're told in Titus 1 and 5 that there should be a plurality of elders. Evangelists are often sent to work in pairs, according to Acts 13 and 2. And we are told that there is no central source of church knowledge and authority, because to do so would be to supplant God. No central human source, that is. Matthew 23 and 9. So one of the reasons that the Bible warns against these rigid top-down human structures is because charismatic leaders sometimes get things wrong. And there has to be some kind of mechanism in place for if a leader is wrong about something. And scriptural evidence should always take precedent over the opinions of a specific single leader. Paul warned about this in 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 through 3, when he said, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving." And unsurprisingly, famous cult leaders like David Koresh or Jim Jones or Warren Jeffs each strictly controlled things like marriages and marital activity. They strictly controlled the diets of their congregants, all of these things that were already being mentioned in 1 Timothy 4. In a similar vein, the Bible teaches against something called soothsaying in Deuteronomy 18 and 10, for example. And soothsaying ties into this overall topic of unusual leadership and charismatic speakers because it essentially refers to people in authority who used esoteric, supposedly sacred, sometimes magical words to deceive people into thinking that they had supernatural powers. Now, even though people in the United States today don't typically believe in incantations, there are still charismatic speakers who use their silver tongues to influence congregants to attach themselves to a particular speaker's interpretation of the Bible rather than reading Scripture for themselves. So, if someone brings concerns about unusual leadership and strict hierarchical structure, then Christian leaders need to assure that they are treating Jesus as the only absolute leader of the church, and that other leadership roles have checks and balances in place, such as dividing the church responsibilities between different members of the congregation, plurality of elders, and so forth. Importantly, I think we need to recognize the possibility that some congregations may feature charismatic speakers who have become de facto leaders, not because they were planning to do anything wrong, but this circumstance I don't think is particularly productive, and it's not helpful in conversations about cult-like qualities. And congregations that face this challenge, where there's just kind of one de facto leader, should prompt that leader to train other members to share in leadership responsibilities if they can. That topic is more complicated than I'm going to be able to cover before my time is out here. But that's something where I imagine it would be a good idea to conceive of a plan of action for changing those circumstances. The next area is member abuse. Physical, verbal, or emotional harm to members of the group, usually in an attempt to manipulate the congregants into bolstering the authority and power of the leadership. The churches of Christ do have a long-standing position on corporal violence that's grounded in Jesus' words to the governor in John 18:36, where Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now my kingdom is not from here." Incidentally, the churches of Christ have historically been so dedicated to this position that conscientious objection to carnal warfare is actually kind of a known quality, a distinguishing factor for our group. And I think that this is correct, that Jesus would not have Christians to wield violence against other people, whether warfare or perhaps even in interpersonal interactions. And again, this is something that there's not time to discuss in lots of detail, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that interpersonal violence like spousal abuse falls into this category. That's very common in contemporary cults. Spousal abuse is a sin, and leaders who excuse or cover up spousal violence are sharing in that. That's not something that people should be able to point to among the churches of Christ. Furthermore, verbal and emotional violence are also condemned in Scripture, even though they might be discussed less in the pulpit. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but just give some things to think about. Proverbs 16:24 tells us that kind words are like honey. Well, we might hear that and think, okay, that's nice, that's a good idea. But then we get more specific things as well. Ephesians 4:29 says to let no corrupting talk come out of our mouths. And Colossians 4:6 commands us to temper our speech with grace. Gracious speech does not just mean soft-spoken or eloquent. According to Strong, it means that which affords joy or pleasure or delight, loveliness. We're told this should be a defining quality of the way that we interact with others. So, of course, that would negate being mean, rude, hurtful, especially to spouses. So our conclusion must be that God does care about the things that we say. Speech, too, is an action that influences others for good or for evil. And the call to action for Christians, I think, is to take concerns about mean-spiritedness in whatever form it presents itself seriously enough to correct that. So if someone brings concerns about cultism and they're drawing attention to physical, verbal, or other kinds of abuse, Christians should assure them that God does care very much about how we treat each other, and then take seriously and genuinely any concerns that are brought up and investigate them if need be. Next, we have financial manipulation. Most groups that are typically agreed in the public as being cults are groups that featured leaders that demanded control of most or all of the members' assets. This problem has recently more or less morphed into something that we might call the prosperity doctrine in recent years. This is when leadership promises blessings upon congregants in exchange for large contributions of money, and those large contributions typically only benefit the leadership. So they basically get rich at the expense of their followers. Jesus explicitly addressed this with the Pharisees in Matthew 23:14. He said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive a greater condemnation." Many of the Old Testament prophets also expressed God's disdain with cheating and oppressing people for personal gain. So if someone brings a concern about cultism related to financial issues, like a group taking up a collection, for example, I think Christian leaders should be ready to explain regulations on uses of the contribution to ensure that care of the funds is shared among congregational leaders, and to check that the leadership is not living more extravagantly than their average members. In other words, there are specific ways that the Bible prescribes using church money, and the money should not simply be controlled by one person, nor should it exclusively benefit 1, 2, 3 people in the congregation. And finally, we have something called alignment behaviors or defensiveness. Christians should certainly attempt to the best of their ability to have a positive relationship with others in the world around them. However, there may occasionally be people with ill intent toward Christianity despite the best efforts of authentic leaders. So what do we say in the case that someone attacks the reputation of a church with which we're affiliated, especially if that person is lashing out of anger, perhaps even calling that church a cult? The Apostle Paul gave us an example of what I think is a useful model for responding to unfair criticism in his reply to the accusation that he was a seditionist leader in Acts 24. Also, an important starting point here is that Paul was not actually causing the harm that he was being accused of. It was a false accusation. So the appropriate response to a fair accusation is, of course, to make corrections. But if we receive a false accusation, there might also be some things that we can learn here. In Acts 24, verses 2 through 9, a speaker named Tertullus provided prosecution against Paul in Governor Felix's court. He accuses Paul of being a heretical leader in verse 5, a profaner in verse 6, and someone who cheats the law in verse 7. Rather than throwing up his hands and saying that labels and accusations didn't matter, Paul actually replies to this point for point in verses 10 through 20. The apostle said that he had recently worshiped in the temple without causing any violent dissent in verse 12. He highlights his accuser's lack of evidence in verse 13. He explained that he was following the word of God instead of creating heresy in verses 14 and 15, and he emphasized the peaceful nature of his beliefs in verse 16. In verses 17 through 21, Paul provides his own evidence that he had held certain beliefs without causing any problem or enmity with others, and he concludes by arguing that he was essentially being targeted because of a single belief that he held about the resurrection, which he was not leveraging to hurt anyone. It's just something that he thought. So I have a couple of takeaways here regarding how to respond to false accusations, and these are broad to account for the potential need to tailor things to specific situations. The first thing is, of course, be honest about our behaviors, the behaviors of previous Christians. In the case of Paul, criticisms were untrue, but again, if there are valid criticisms, investigate those and act upon those. But secondly, be engaged with personal accusations. I have some ideas for how we can do that in productive ways. There may be times to ignore criticism, but if you know someone conveying a genuine, authentic concern for you, be willing to talk with them about those concerns.